Good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight for the second of two lectures in our spring 2022 edition of the Great Minds, Great Ideas lecture series. Great Minds, Great Ideas is a collegiate lecture series generously sponsored by Patricia Stacy Healy and Helen Stacy and held in a partnership between Cazenovia College, Manlius Library, and Cazenovia Public Library. Tonight's presentation will be delivered by Campbell Copland, associate lecturer at Cazenovia College. Campbell's presentation tonight is titled Where the Orenda is at its Fullest, Perspectives on the Iroquois Shaman. So I will now get out of the way and see the screen to Campbell.
All right, thank you, Bill. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone that's tuned in tonight. Really appreciate you being present for this talk. This is something I'm very excited about and grateful for this opportunity. You know, the research entailed with this particular project, the Iroquois Shaman and perspectives on Iroquois spirituality. This is the ability to present some of my findings here tonight to you. I do consider as something of a milestone for me regarding inquiries into the nature of life and reality that I've held dear and have been steadfastly pursuing for almost 20 years now. And you know, I just want to go briefly over a little intro. I do think it's somewhat important for the sake of context. You know, there's the topic itself, the research itself, and then there's how one interacts with it and to what end. Just by way of an intro, I just want to set that up a little bit before we get into the thick of it. So as I said, this is a topic that's interested me for almost 20 years now, going back to 2004, taking advantage of an abroad opportunity that was offered at my undergraduate school, St. Lawrence University. Through that program, I did a summer semester in Peru. With the specific purpose of studying, as they termed it then, primitive healing techniques. I think that's become a little outdated of a way to phrase it, but it wasn't meant in any sort of derogatory sense or anything like that. It was, you know, a pursuit of pilgrimage, for instance, more than like a missionary sort of trip. You know, what shamanism and that type of spirituality had to offer was something that myself and the class that went with me down there were really interested in contrast to what you know, Western medicine had to offer. Not that they were mutually exclusive, but you know, there was some holes in each with you know, perhaps the most effective methods of healing people. But with Western medicine, in particular, these healing techniques of the Peruvian shamans that we studied offered alternatives to machine-oriented diagnostics, you know, and the pervasiveness of mind-numbing pills given as prescriptions to be used like Band-Aids. They showed a way to get in touch with those parts of yourself in a much more immediate and urgent sense than what was otherwise offered. And through my experiences there in Peru, I only became more interested in what this whole topic had to offer. And you know, my fascination was exponentially deepened, and I've been wanting to look further and further into the spirituality and healing practices of shamanism ever since. And, you know, at the end of the day, this trip to Peru, and why I elaborate on it as long as I have already, I do think it expresses one of those cute forms of logic that life seems to force on us every so often. In the sense of I had to fly halfway across the world to learn about a topic that was also happening in my backyard all along. And even after returning from Peru, I kept my inquiries into shamanism and my interest at a pretty general level, and just tried to go through the basics of the texts that were out there. Mircea Eliade's Shamanism, for instance, Michael Harner's The Way of the Shaman, Carlos Castaneda was another writer that was important to me in that moment. But also there's thinkers such as Terence McKenna. I was fascinated with him and how he was learning or teaching how to integrate, shamanic beliefs and perspectives on reality, integrating those with, cutting edge scientific theories regarding the quantum realm and stuff like that. There's a lot of interest in that sort of holistic outlook dating back from the 80s, and I caught the bug there for a bit myself. And as an aspiring poet, which that really is the root cause of my wanting to look into these modes of spirituality, I could never stop myself from daydreaming over the idea of like reading through the Homers of the world and the Virgils, and how they described the grandiosity of the landscapes that their stories were taking place in. I thought I had a hunch that there must have been a time and place when there was a people here in CNY that thought equally epically about the landscapes that CNY had to offer. Green Lake, for instance, Stone Quarry Hill, Chittenango Falls. There's no question in my mind that those landmarks set the scene for stories no less epic in scope than what the ancient Greeks or Romans were working with. And in addition, there's no question places such as these were the stomping grounds for a whole other pantheon of gods. But how did these events transpire? Who were the mythic personages that populated these stories? How did the first poets of this region interact with their environment, both natural and supernatural? I wanted to be informed by these things in the crafting of my own, sort of poetics, my own writing voice, and for the sake of research for works of fiction that are currently in the works that also take place in and around Syracuse on a historical scale. But yeah, that does it for the introductory remarks about myself. Thank you for enduring those. Getting more specific to the topic here, before we get into Iroquoian shamanism in particular, I just want to offer a few general remarks on shamanism for those that might not be so familiar with the concept in a general way. And again, for the sake of setting things up and creating some context, to go over some general trends of shamanism as it's been expressed all over the world, I think really helps better understand what the Iroquois have to offer with this type of spirituality. So firstly, to my mind, the most immediately accessible definition of what a shaman is comes from an article by Aki Holtkrantz entitled Spirit Lodge, a North American Shamanistic Seance. And their definition runs, a shaman is a practitioner who, with the help of spirits, cures the sick or reveals hidden things, etc., while being in a state of ecstasy. Mircea Eliade, as I had mentioned him earlier, he wrote sort of the classic text on shamanism, entitled just that, Shamanism. He specifies the methodology behind these ecstatic cures as journeys to the upper and lower worlds, and or otherwise inaccessible regions here on Earth, such as the depths of the ocean, often for the purpose of a task such as soul retrieval. That was an important duty of the resident shaman for Aboriginal society and culture. And the ecstasy itself is induced any number of ways, varies from region to region, some of which we'll get into more detail shortly with specific regard to the Iroquois. But some of the most common general methods towards this ecstasy include fasting, dance, dream, hallucinogens, and the use of sweat lodges. And to further set up the context here, excuse me, just one moment. A quote that I just want to throw out there that I think best highlights the general contrast in mentality between European Western culture and Aboriginal culture. This quotation from Shakespeare from his last play, The Tempest. It's kind of a short one, but it's out there. Every third thought shall be my grave. It was a line that he gave to Prospero, the hero of his last play. Every third thought shall be my grave. And I think that line really embodies sort of the mindset many of us today walk around with. Certainly it seems indicative of like industrialized civilization. But if we were to offer an equivocal statement in Aboriginal terms, I think it would run something like every third thought shall be my prayer. And while prayer here should perhaps be taken on pretty relative terms, in the sense of the Aboriginal habits of prayer were more entwined with their day-to-day activities than the way that we compartmentalize them today, I still think it holds up pretty nicely as far as drawing this contrast. And you know, this contrast that again sort of alludes to much of my preoccupation with these shamanic figures of Aboriginal and ancient societies. They possessed a knowledge of and lived out a life of a kind of sacredness that seems to have completely vanished off the face of the earth, more or less. But one that is, I think, still very possible, and I think people are sincerely on that sort of path today. And it's one that, you know, I'd like to try and recapture as well as much as possible, just for the sake of my sanity and just trying to be a good person out there. But anyway, moving on. A few other general remarks before we get into the specifics. One of my go-to anthropologists that has really helped me, you know, see beyond the surface level and you know, really give a clearer picture of Aboriginal consciousness is Lucian Levy Bruhl, a Frenchman from the turn of the 1900s. He seemed to have one of the more sensitive and sympathetic perspectives when writing on Aboriginal culture and civilization. Many other researchers and field workers either weren't capable of picking up on the subtle differences of mentality between Western civilized man and Aboriginal civilized man, or they were utterly dismissive of these subtleties. And only considered them in a sort of disparaging way. But it was different with Levy Bruhl. And two terms that he coined, and which I think sort of accessibly defines these subtleties and mentality that he was picking up on. One he termed as mystical participation, and the other was termed by presence. Mystical participation involves identification or partial identification between oneself and certain objects outside of oneself, whether it be a rock, an animal, a feather. You know, there's no distinctive line drawn between self and other in a relationship like that. if the object is damaged, for instance, then one's person is collaterally damaged as well, and vice versa. The other term, by presence, refers to a similar dynamic, but namely in associating certain objects with someone else, whether it be an ancient ancestor, a living person, or a deity. There's little to no distinguishing between the person in question and the object in question. Yes, for instance, my mother is passed on, but at least part of her is still present in this photo that I have of her, for just as an example. That was not a leap of faith type of logic that people of Aboriginal societies needed to work towards. It was a very matter-of-fact mentality and outlook with objects and the associations that they held of other people. One last remark here, and this is more specific to the Iroquois iteration of shamanism. Joseph Campbell, who, if you're unfamiliar, is perhaps considered one of the leading thinkers in this cross section of fields that the study of shamanism entails. With archaeology, anthropology, mythology. Campbell devotes a lot of writing in developing the contrast between the archetypal figure of the priest versus that of the shaman. The priest is seen as more of a mediator, more as keeping the relationship between the average person and the relationship with God more at arm's length, or reliant on other people besides the person themselves. Whereas the shaman offers a more immediate experience and is based on the visionary capacity of not only the shaman, but the people that they're trying to help cure as well. But with the Iroquois, they perhaps, arguably struck one of the more harmonious balances of shamanic practices between these figures of the priest and shaman. In many ways transcended that paradoxical relation. And I think that's a very fascinating trend, based perhaps, in my speculation, on the geographical location that the Iroquois sort of rose up in here in CNY. It tended to be a pretty busy cross section of a lot of different migratory patterns, whether from the north and south, or even people coming over from the Bering Strait, and on the other side of the Atlantic. It had a lot of different influences accumulate in this one particular area. And the Iroquois in general were very open to influence. That's another distinctive quality of their shamanic figures as well. Willing to pick up on different aspects of really any other type of spirituality they encounter, if they think that it would better reinforce their medicine, give them more effective results in what they were trying to do. Really interesting perspective, again, in sort of contrast to what they came up against when the Europeans came over. But that sort of does it for the general remarks. To really start to get into the thick of it here, I'd like first to go over some of the core beliefs and mythological tales that make up the mind space of the Iroquois average citizen, but more specifically the beliefs and mythology that the shamanic figures were sort of operating from and with in the different rituals and practices that they upheld. Excuse me again. So with that being said, the first thing, the centerpiece of the whole belief system of the Iroquois is centered around the creation myth. And this is similar to many other Aboriginal and ancient cultures around the world, where it serves as a organizational centerpiece for the community life. Without having some passing knowledge of the creation myth, it would be sort of difficult to understand much else regarding the Iroquoian metaphysics and spirituality without having reference to this. Interestingly enough, there are many different versions of this creation myth extant readily out there and pretty easily available. Not only do each of the 5 nations have it rendered into their own languages, but translators have taken the time to render into English each of those 5 different versions. And along with the translated versions, there's many recorded versions from folklorists and other mythologists that were curious about this aspect of the Iroquois from back in the day. Because of this, it has caused no small amount of variance, and in some cases redaction from version to version. It does take perhaps the reading of a few of them to gain the most comprehensive perspective. And that is why there's one particular version that was created that I it's sort of my go-to, and I think the author did just that, pulling from all the different sources simultaneously to create one comprehensive picture. Robert Moss is the author in his book Dreamways of the Iroquois. It's the most comprehensive, most coherently put together. And in order to achieve that end, and I think he admits as much as this at some point in his book, the sort of liberties that he did have to take to create a good sense of flow and harmony from passage to passage, it was probably considerable, the liberties that he did take. And that might be seen as rather controversial, but it is on the other hand, sort of perfectly in line with a lot of the values that were held by the Iroquoian storytellers, with the ad-libbing and the spontaneous sort of freestyle based on momentary inspiration. That's something that we'll get into here a bit more in a bit more detail just shortly. But either way, the another person I'd like to mention, the preeminent, probably most preeminent Iroquois scholar, J.N.B. Hewitt, he had the major task of undertaking each of the English translations of the 5 versions from each of the 5 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. And again, it's out there on the internet with just a little bit of poking around. It's easily obtainable. If you ever want to go back to the original wording and the transliterations and stuff, it makes for a fascinating process. And it's also interesting to see how we start with those transliterations and get to what ends up becoming a version like Robert Moss, what he was able to create. And as opposed to sort of just going over it straight up, I want to just highlight and isolate some different aspects of the creation myth that I think are most relevant to the shamanic spirituality and some of the specific practices and rituals that they uphold to enact their medicine. But at the beginning, the creation myth begins in the realm that is termed the earth and the sky. And this is a higher realm that existed prior to our planet, to our earth, and whose source of light was from the glow of the tree of life that was present there. The beginning of the story of the creation myth details the maturation of a young woman who we come to know as Sky Woman. In her interactions with a figure who's named Earth Holder, he's one of the more powerful personages in this realm of the earth and the sky. Between him and the Sky Woman, there some misunderstanding arises that leads to the Sky Woman's forced exile from the earth and the sky. And it is pretty interesting to read through these interactions between Sky Woman and Earth Holder, which they're courtship scenes, but they're rather twisted, overly prudent courtship scenes, and making the misunderstanding that arises between them seem rather inevitable or forced. But in the course of her fall from the earth and the sky, she gets kicked out, and it's just a free fall into a dark, watery realm. And that's the realization that Sky Woman comes to, is that she's just basically about to fall into a malformed pit of water. But to save her from this fate, as she's falling, a group of herons take her dress up in their beaks, and they considerably slow her fall, making the impact much less fatalistic. That leaves enough time for beaver and muskrat to call turtle for help and scour the bottom of the sea for some dirt to put on turtle's back to begin the process of making what becomes the earth, the territory of the earth. All of these animals that are mentioned in the beginning scenes here are subsequently held in much reverence with the Iroquois people. In the figure of the Sky Woman, I do think there's some parallels worth noting, having to do with the figure of the feminine Holy Ghost or Sophia figure in the mythos of esoteric Christianity in the form of the Gnostics, and esoteric Judaism in the form of the Kabbalists. There seems to be some real potent overlap there that is fascinating to track whenever you're getting to know any one culture's mythology. To see those interconnections is rather makes you awestruck sometimes. But the myth for the rest of the story focuses mainly on Sky Woman's grandchildren, and they're two brothers, two twins. It's a variation on again to reference Christianity, the sort of Cain and Abel reference. With Norse mythology, you could resort to the Thor and Loki, and the Thor and Loki comparison, I think, is compounded as well, interestingly, with them being from Asgard. I think Asgard parallels pretty specifically with the earth and the sky, and the presence of the tree of life, which is also big in Norse mythology. Again, when mythologies that are on two different sides of the Atlantic from one another, just creates some interesting notions and speculation as to how information was being transmitted in our ancient times. But moving on, the two brothers of the Iroquois myth are named Theron Hiawakan, and the English translation works out to something like he who holds on to the sky with both hands. And we'll refer to him even more easily as Skyholder. That's a shortened name given to him. And his brother is named Tawaskaran, which translates out to man of flint, or Iceman, or stone mirror. he is seen as like the more negative, darker brother of the two. Skyholder is more idealized as the savior type figure, the do-gooder. But J.N.B. Hewitt, the aforementioned Iroquois scholar, describes Iceman in a very interesting way. The personification of the winter power transformed into a man being, a god of winter whose breath and magic power blight the verdure of plants and trees and lock lakes and rivers in bonds of ice. Beyond this sort of definition, there's always been a push otherwise to try to create some similarities between Iceman with our Christian notions of Satan. That was the way the Jesuits, when they first came over here in the early 1600s, that's how they tried to make sense of that contrast. But it's far less severe than that. And I think Hewitt's definition, extended definition, really honors that. You know, as far as like the beneficial effects that winter has on rejuvenating nature and allowing it to refreshen itself, giving it a chance to rest. Those are all, you know, sort of could easily be seen as positive aspects in the cycle of life that need to happen in order for things to be sustained in the way they are. And so in that regard, Iceman, even though he's seen as the darker or more evil-minded of the two, he also has these redeeming qualities about him. And even beyond that, the essential challenges which make up much of the rest of the creation myth, the essential challenges that arise between these two twins, these two brothers, not only define a lot of the ritualization of Iroquois culture, but you know, the antagonism between them is seen as, you know, a divergence that's to be integrated into one, as opposed to being dismissed, expelled, or repressed, you know, however method, you know, we would get rid of sort of the satanic influences through the methodology of Christianity. There was you know, more of a desire to try to see how, in many ways, this light and dark type characters show a lot of similarities, and that's what the plot mechanics sort of lead to with a lot of the stories that happen with them, how they share certain characteristics of one another, and one of them coming to that realization of how similar they are. As wonderful as Skyholder is, as honorable and true, you know, he's also very capable of unbalanced bouts of anger and deception, and in the most extreme instance, murder. Iceman, for his part, he's capable of love, he's creative, brings people to laughter with his sense of humor, you know, as sarcastic and dark as it might be. But you know, there are these aspects of them that need to be reckoned with and integrated from one end to the other. And that sort of leads to the main metaphysical concept that underscores much of Iroquois spirituality, and that's the interplay of energy between Orenda and its shadow, Atgan. In their legacy, Skyholder and Iceman characterize these two contrasting principles, and the best way perhaps to define them beyond that characterization for Orenda, you know, it's probably best to think of it as a kind of pervasive life force that underscores all of visible reality. You know, if trying to make sense of it in more modern terms, even thinking of it as something like consciousness, or even maybe reaching back into the more recent past, the aether, which was sort of popular with the Theosophists. There's overlap with those terms and what is meant by Orenda. It can transform into Atgan in innumerable different ways. Human emotions are perhaps the best trigger for that twist in turning the positive energy into negative, jealousy, anger, pride, lust, all those sort of those typically negative emotions. But the energy in this case, when it has been turned into Akdan, can be thought of as negatively charged with dark malintent, but it's left open to be sort of forever redeemable, which I think is an important aspect to emphasize. It can either be shorted out and just canceled out in and of itself and be done with by one form or another, or it can be changed back into pure Orenda. That was a belief held strong by the Iroquois, and this holds particularly true with people who had sort of gone over perhaps a little bit too far to the dark side, and there's some instance of that we'll get into here. The best example to illustrate how this life energy of Orenda plays out according to Iroquoian belief, I think is best represented if we were to consider a rock. According to our perhaps more materialist modes of classification in the West, a rock is labeled as, it's pretty cut and dry, as an inanimate object. With Orenda, if we're to look at the world through that sort of lens, and thinking back to those terms that we went over earlier, the mystic participation and the bi-presence, a rock can become all too easily enlivened as an object of prayer or veneration through this energy of shared identification, whether it's deific or ancestral. And the gestures towards literalness in expressing these notions entails like the placing of freshly made food or tobacco or other nutritious organic matter as a way of keeping the deity or ancestor housed in this rock, satisfied and happy. And staying true to the fluidity between Orenda and Akdan in considering the same rock, it could also be used as a charm involving spells of love or bewitchment. It can be charged, by, for instance, having the sorcerer or witch spit on it while concentrating on the evil intent in their mind, or by daubing it in the blood of one of their power animals, or by carving some symbol into it. All of these different methods really, imbue that inanimate object with a pretty potent energy and sense of life that is not otherwise considered, in our, metaphysics in the West, I think. But moving on here, I want to get to particularly the aspects of dreaming that happen often with the Iroquois. It really can't be emphasized enough just how important the act of dreaming was to the Iroquois. As Robert Moss, the mentioned author earlier, quotes a Jesuit father's observations from 1669 in his Dreamways of the Iroquois. The quote from the Jesuit father runs, "The Iroquois have, properly speaking, only a single divinity, the dream. To it they render their submission and follow all its orders with the utmost exactness." As Moss goes on to describe, in a very literal way, life and death decisions were based on the images and scenarios revealed to the Iroquois in their sleep. It was one of the first things discussed in the morning. People would go around asking one another if they had a dream, and if so, to tell them all about it, to try to help them make sense of what it could be meaning for them, or how they can use it to develop their life in a positive way. At root, the dream had a threefold function for the Iroquois. The first of which was as a medium of communication between the dreamer and their ancestors and other deities. For the Iroquois to receive messages from these types of personages was not necessarily uncommon. As Handsome Lake, a Seneca shaman prophet, is quoted as saying, and I like this a lot, the distance between the living and the dead is exactly as wide as the edge of a maple leaf. And the way this razor thin edge was typically bridged was through the agency of dream. These communications could be for the sake of teaching, of warning, for either the dreamer or the ancestor spirit deity. They might be in trouble and are reaching out for help themselves, or for the sake of signaling one, for the calling of a great dreamer or shaman. In the Iroquois language, one who dreams is synonymous with what we would term shaman in translation. The second essential function that dreaming held for the Iroquois was for its prophetic capabilities. These prophetic vision dreams came in handy for both major and minor events alike. A shaman, as one of his duties, or one of their duties, would often be asked to dream scout the location of game for hunting purposes. Obviously, other prophetic dreams could potentially pretend to much graver circumstances, like the coming of an invading tribe. But with how seriously the Iroquois took their dreamers and the dreamers' dreams, instances of this sort would sometimes be the only chance that gave the Iroquois society a chance to prepare and fortify themselves if indeed another tribe was on the way. And that brings to mind another thing that's important to realize too, is that dreamers could be said to be under constant audit in Iroquois society. If someone feels as if they've had a big dream and they want it to be heard and somehow followed or instituted, there will always be people at the ready to listen and help them in that regard, to see how well they can come to fruition. But on the other hand, if the dream does not come to fruition, if the people are listening to them, are doing as they're instructed by the dreamer, and things do not work out as planned or as thought, then without much to do, they sort of wash their hands of the dreamer in that regard, and it would be hard for them to ever be taken seriously ever again, if they had a similar experience. Moving on from the dreams, I'll leave it at where I stopped. I don't think I quite finished, but just for the sake of moving on. Other aspects regarding the belief systems and the important myths that helped form the outlook of the Iroquois. Beyond the creation myth itself, the lore behind Hiawatha and the Peacemaker and their rival Tharadaho, that really comprises the second most important mythological stories to be kept alive amongst Iroquois society and to be interpreted and looked into for how to live the right way of life, how do shamans activate their abilities, get in touch with their abilities. I think it's interesting too. Hiawatha and Peacemaker are credited with having created the unification of the Five Nations, the Iroquois Confederacy. But they also seem to echo, the twins' relationship from the creation myth, Iceman and Skyholder. There's this carryover of the darker and more ambiguous elements that both of these figures, Hiawatha and Peacemaker, have to sort of reckon with in order to attain the goals that they have of this peace, this widespread peace amongst nations. There's very little agreement from source to source as to the exact timeline of these events. They are more or less historically oriented. So the older sources, even dating back from the Jesuits, date the unification of the Five Nations to sometime around 1400 to 1500. It seems like with the more current research in play right now, it's landed a little bit earlier, even to somewhere around 1100 AD. And there's other more out there thinkers, speculators that try to or are trying to prove it needs to be pushed back even earlier than that. There's some uncertainty regarding the exact nature of the relationship between Hiawatha and Peacemaker, whether they were possibly twins, doppelgangers, or again, these more out there alternative interpretations that Peacemaker was some sort of guardian angel, deific type figure that only Hiawatha could perceive. There's a lot of speculation out there. Most of those more out there speculations come from Robert Moss in that Dreamways of the Iroquois, William Volman as well in his Fathers and Crows is willing to entertain those more out there speculations about their relationship. Though even when reading through a much more conservative classic like William Beauchamp's Iroquois folklore, there's clearly some confusion in the parts relating the adventures of Hiawatha and Peacemaker as to who he's exactly referring to in some instances, in some particular scenarios. He seems to be almost unknowingly using Hiawatha and Peacemaker interchangeably as names. Regardless, though, they in many ways represent the quintessential shamanic figure specific to the Iroquois, holding as they did the selfless value of widespread peace as their primary goal. They also flawlessly sort of combined the roles of culture hero and trickster figure, which is behind our modern conceptualizations of the shaman. To be able to combine those roles is one of the qualifications. Not only did they establish the unification of the five nations, but in Hiawatha's case, he also founded or is credited as founding the primary form of communication used amongst the Iroquois, in the form of wampum beads. As for Peacemaker, it was his dreams, as recorded, as the tales record, that served as the initial impetus behind the unification of the five nations. Also, his very symbolic stone white canoe was a supernatural object that held many people in fascination and awe, giving him the authority that was required to be convincing to other chiefs when he went to negotiate this peace. But the trickster aspects as well that I was referring to earlier, they're well defined in these two figures, as heroic as they otherwise are. Peacemaker, for his part, as it's recorded, was conceived by a virgin, for instance, and because of that, similar to the lore behind Jesus Christ, he was forever held in great suspicion by his community. People attempted to put him to death numerous times. He always sort of supernaturally survived each attempt, mystifying people's making their mind blown as far as how he could come back from some of the ways that they tried to off him. But this it really only deepened people's suspicions and paranoia about him. But again, it was his dreams or when he communicated his dreams about wanting to unify, even then people were just accusing him of wanting to instigate warfare and rile everybody up, and it wasn't seen as very effective. Hiawatha, for his part, when he arrived on the scene and became chief, he was held in awe because of how eloquent and conversationally he could speak. And the people around him were forever encouraging him to go out to the neighboring nations and try to instill some sense of peace with how bad relations have gotten. He always refused. He was leery of leaving his village and his 7 daughters behind. He was fearful that something would happen to him if he wasn't there. And fate being what it is, even before his very eyes, more or less, they did end up eventually being lethally bewitched because he would refuse to leave. And there's speculation as to the exact perpetrator of this act, who bewitched and lethally killed Hiawatha's daughters. There's some that think it was Hiawatha's colleagues themselves that hired out to an evil sorcerer type figure to off his daughters, make it seem like his rival Faradaho, in the hopes to finally get him to leave the village and make those efforts to unification. Other sources think it was his rival Faradaho in and of itself, Faradaho is definitely seen as this furthering of a characterization of evil that was not really represented in the creation myth, but it seems to be brought to a further extent in this particular myth with Hiawatha. But circling back to Hiawatha real quick here, instead of prompting him into action, the death of his daughters caused him to have a nervous breakdown. He fled the village and became more or less wild until Peacemaker finally came on the scene. By the time Peacemaker found him, Hiawatha had apparently been pretty busy pursuing the Atkan path of life, falling into habits of cannibalism, for instance, also putting aside all of the usual ceremonials that were sacredly held and adhered to when hunting for other animal. He wasn't doing any of those required actions. Peacemaker did cure him through the agency of song, deputizing him to the cause of unification. Hiawatha was finally game. And again, I think the most important metaphysical implication from this sort of episode is the capacity for redemption possible, even in these scenarios where things have strayed pretty far over to the dark side. Hiawatha was able to be brought back and redeemed, through the methodology of a shaman healer, as is eventually Faradaho by the end of the tale. Peacemaker cures him of the insanity that was entangling his mind. And again, like a very symbolic gesture, Faradaho, as evil as he was seen, when they did finally affect the unification of the five nations, he was crowned as like the chief of chiefs, really, amongst the representatives of the five nations. And the Onondagas, which is who he was the head of, were the central tribe, being the fire keepers and the ceremonial keepers of that unification. But I'll leave it at that. I feel like I'd be asking much too much of anybody else to endure much beyond that point. But yeah, thanks for hearing it out as far as we were able to get into it.